What we're doing today is the understitching sewing seam sample. This is for your sewing books. What understitching is used for is anything to keep a facing to the inside of a garment. So looking at the picture here, the facing is made out of the solid blue. The actual garment is made out of the floral or paisley blue. If you take a look inside your manufactured clothes at home, you will see understitching inside many collars of dresses, necklines of shirts that aren't knits. You'll see understitching in places. Pencil skirts have it inside the waistline, so you will see that. And the more we do these sewing samples, the more you'll start to see them pop up on your clothes. So the first thing we're going to do is to create 2 fabric samples that are 8 by 4. Make sure they are on grain. Remember, the grain line goes parallel to the selvage. The next thing is with right sides together. Stitch the 2 fabric samples along that 8-inch side with a 5/8-inch seam allowance and trim your threads. You'll open that fabric sample, lay it flat on the ironing board, and that's this guy here. You'll push the seam allowances towards one of your sample sides, and then from there, pin the seam allowances in place. So you'll be taking pins and going through that side, pinning that in place. Your last step will be to stitch at 1/8 of an inch away from that seam, stitch the actual, what we call understitching. If you do something like this on the side and lose it and go outside of the 1/8, that's where you're going to lose points on the assignment. So what I'm grading on is, are you on grain? When you pinned, was the seam allowance pushed to one side? And when you stitched, did you stitch straight? Okay. If you remember from before how we made pattern pieces, we're going to do 8 by 4. The one I have here is an 8 by 5. I'm going to make it an 8 by 4. So I'm measuring with that grid ruler 4 inches off of here and drawing at the end. Then I'll swing my ruler, make sure that the edge goes into one of the lines from the grid, and do the right angle from there. And I'm just going to trim that off. So now what was my 8 by 5 is now an 8 by 4. I need 2 of these cut from my material with the grain line parallel to the selvage. Because I need 2, I'm actually going to fold that over, making sure it's on grain, which means however I folded it needs to be the same distance away from the fold to the selvage at both ends. So I've got 6 inches from the fold to the selvage, 6 inches from the fold to the selvage. So that is folded on grain. For pinning, I want to make sure that my grain line is parallel to the selvage. And at this time in the class year, we're just going to eyeball it, because that's also a skill we need to learn. You need to be able to recognize that if I pin it like this, that's off grain, because visually that arrow is not parallel to this. So visually, this looks parallel to here. Later on in the school year, we will learn to measure grain lines and get things to be more precise. But for now, the visual skill of knowing when something doesn't look right is important as well. Remember when to cut. You're going to drag your scissors along the table, and you're only moving that top thumb when you cut. So you're dragging it along like this, and you're standing up. Moving forward on the next sewing sample, which will be Stitch in the Ditch, I won't show you how to pin or how to draw the pattern, but know that this is how you do it for future reference. Remove your pins. because I folded, or when I laid this out to cut it, I already had the right sides together. That saves me a step. When I take the pattern off, I can just start to pin it. It says pin right sides together along the 8x4 side. And I'm going to stitch that at 5/8. So along the 8-inch side, I'm putting my pins just like we've done in the past, about a finger distance apart. Bring it to the sewing machine. Make sure the machine is set on a stitch length 3, and our directions won't say a stitch length 3. These are just things that you guys should be picking up along the way, that, oh, if I'm sewing and it's a normal seam, it needs to be 3 inches, or sorry, stitch length 3. 5/8 is marked on all the machines, so you will put the perpendicular raw edge right underneath the needle, which is where the oval is on the presser foot, and you'll take the perpendicular edge and put it along your 5/8. So parallel goes along under the needle, perpendicular goes along 5/8. You're going to go forward 3 stitches, and then backwards to the end of the fabric, and then stitch it at 5/8. So I'm watching here. I am not watching the needle. When you sew, you're watching your eye point is the edge of the fabric and your spot on the needle plate. Keep your hands to the outside of the presser foot. And when I get to the end, all the way to the end and back stitch 3, lift the presser foot and then cut on the side. Trim the threads. Next, you're going to take the sample, open it up on the ironing board, finger press it just like we did patchwork, and press it open. Give it some steam if you wish. After that, the instructions tell you to push it to one side. The reason you press it open first is to break the straightness of the yarns. You want to press fabric open so that the yarns that make up the fabric get the idea that it should be going on opposite direction. But because we're understitching, we need to then, after we've broken, put a fold in, if you will, a crease, you're going to push it over to one side. And that will leave it nice and smooth on the outside. Next, we will do this. My seam allowance are towards the bottom rectangle. So I'm going to put the pins through the top, going through the seam allowance underneath. And you can also keep the fabric on the table while you're pinning, like that. Just check it once in a while that you're coming through on the back. Meaning you don't need to hold it up in the air and try and pin. You can keep it flat on the table and pin across. Okay, very last step. You're going to stitch the seam 1/8 away from the fold. So the fold that we pressed in at the iron, which is actually the seam as well, is going to go up against, I call these the toes of the presser foot, so it goes right up against the right side toe. Also, it is, if you see the oval on the presser foot, 1/8 of an inch is also measured by the left-hand part of the oval, right where my fingernail is. Now I'm just going to stitch it 3 forward, 3 back, and take the pins out as I go. If it ever gets caught like that, you can just raise your foot up and move it ahead a stitch. That's all. And this time my eye, again, is not watching the needle. My eye is watching the inside of that right-handed toe. When you get to the end, go back stitch. Pull it off and cut it on the side, and then trim your threads. Take it and do one last press. And then there's your completed understitching sample.